At a time when we're losing our oldest and most precious trees and forests from around the world, I'm curious to understand if and why this matters to all of us. Welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. I'm Tom Hill, and it's here that I meet with people from all walks of life to explore the answers to one essential question. What do trees mean to you? Hi listeners, it's a pleasure for me to introduce today Kate Colenbrander, and not only that, an honour to be hosting her new film in Arboretum on the Meaning of Trees podcast's YouTube channel. If you haven't already, be sure to check it out because it's genuinely like nothing I've seen before. It delves deep into the significance of trees as living beings worthy of our respect and gratitude. We met through the making of her film, and I've been learning from Kate over the last few months about her research masters for UCL's Anthropology department, where she has used ethnographic film to look deep into the notion of animism, what it is, where it's come from, and where it may or may not exist in society today. Strap in for an episode that unashamedly branches out into new territory in search of answers. Kate, welcome to the Meaning of Trees podcast. We met a little while ago, and we're going to talk a little bit about a film that you've been making this last year, which I featured in, but yeah, it was just a small part of, but I was really fascinated by the concept that you had for that one. And maybe let's talk about you first, if that's okay. Is that all right?
Of course, yeah.
Great. So question one on this podcast, always, what do trees mean to you?
I knew that this was coming, yet I thought I would just kind of let the wind take me as it came to me. And it's funny because it's kind of like there's two main things that have been coming up for me that almost seem opposed. And the first one is that honestly, for a while, trees were just kind of like background to me. Not in the sense of I was indifferent to them, but in the sense of they were just always there. They were just in my mind, always around. The interesting thing about Ontario, which is where I grew up in Toronto, in Canada, is that there's actually not a lot of old growth forest in Ontario itself. I think a lot of people think of Canada as this like monolith of like big, wide, open wilderness. But in a lot of Eastern Canada, which was kind of the first site of colonization, there's a huge effort to just kind of like clear cut and develop. And so you definitely do get in Toronto, there's big kind of forests, but it's not really what you would picture as the kind of classic old big trees. You kind of have to seek that out. They do exist, but as a product of kind of city planning, even back kind of hundreds of years. And then when I moved to British Columbia, when I moved to Vancouver, I remember that was one of the first times where I actually kind of like noticed a tree in a way that it's very hard to ignore a tree when it's 3 times the width of yourself with your arms kind of splayed out. And then that moved me into kind of the second thing that trees mean to me, and that is really resistance. The existence of a tree in itself is, and I remember hearing this from so many people that I interviewed for my documentary, is that no tree is there kind of by accident at this point in development, especially in city environments, but just kind of around the world. It's very easy to think of like untouched landscapes, but it's very rare that there is a part of the earth, what we consider nature, that people aren't aware of. Whether that's people who are living there, developers who want to extract from there, we're very aware of kind of what exists. So a lot of the time, if a tree is there, especially if it's a very old tree, then that is there for a reason, for a purpose, or in resistance of what has been proposed against it. In my later years at UBC, University of British Columbia, I started to get somewhat involved in kind of land defender protests. So that's a lot of the indigenous groups around BC, of which there are many. It's the highest population of independent Indigenous nations in Canada is in British Columbia because it's technically unceded territory. There was never any kind of treaties agreed upon in British Columbia. But a big thing that happened was this protest called Fairy Creek. On Vancouver Island, there's huge swaths of old growth redwoods. And this is like the kind of trees that you see in books where people can't, like I said, reach all the way around. You can have like 5 people all the way around and it's still, they're not touching each other's fingertips. And you would just see pictures coming out of these clear cut efforts where it was the same kind of extreme of size, but it was people lying down in the stumps. So I started to learn about trees as resistance and the kind of presence of them being a product of that and realizing the significance of a tree being there. So that's a very long-winded answer to say that ultimately, I think the direction I'll go with is that trees for me are resistance.
Yeah, I think what you're describing almost is like how I sort of view a million or infinite mini decisions to keep a tree still there. And like how incredible is that that could even happen? It's almost like totally against the odds, but then when you flip it, it actually comes down to something must have made it stay there, you know, something in our collective consciousness or will, if you like, has actually, I suppose, chosen or elected to keep those trees. And you're speaking of that power of resistance. Is that important to you in your life?
Yeah. And like it's definitely something that is like come to be more important to me. It was funny, the more I traveled and got outside of Canada, I realized like what I took for granted in terms of kind of access to quote, wilderness, whatever that really means. But essentially that feeling of vastness. Canada's huge and it's got a population in total of about 30 million people. So there's really a lot of wide open space. So when I started to realize that that's really not the case other places, as basic as that sounds, but you don't think about how that actually feels to be in those places. Even in the UK, when I lived there for a year for my master's, everybody talks about Scotland as being the most wide open of any part of the UK. And I did the West Highland Way. I remember I'd be walking all day, and then still at the end of the day, you find a pub. Still at the end of the day, there's something there. So with trees and with that idea of like all the decisions that it takes to keep them, it was extremely emphasized as I came to places that have been in centuries and centuries and centuries of development with really dense populations, that it is really a decision that they're there. And realizing that, you start to see them everywhere, like especially in London. I had people sending me pictures of London planes for months being like, look at how big this is. And I'm like, I know, it's crazy. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, and what's your own family heritage? So a lot of Europeans moved to North America, and I just wondered if you have much of a understanding of where perhaps your family might have come from, and what are your thoughts around that?
I know pretty much all sides. My dad's half of the family is all Dutch. My dad's parents, so what we call my Oma and Opa, they came to Canada after World War II. So then all the rest of that family is like still in the Netherlands, not the most famous for trees and forests. And then my mom's side of the family, her family, it was all Irish, but like kind of way back. And then my mom's dad, my granddad, his family is all Syrian. They came to Canada at the turn of the 20th century. At that time, there wasn't really the political term of refugee, but they were technically Christian refugees that had come over from Syria. I've looked it up since. It's technically now Lebanon. And he was like I want to say ninth of 10 kids. They went all over Canada. Some of them are in the States now. That is the interesting thing about North America in general, is that identity is a very different concept, I would say, over here. Some people are really deeply connected with their heritage, especially if you look at like Italian Americans or like certain subsets where there was kind of like a swath of immigration at a certain time. And then now big communities have been built up around that. In Canada, with the Chinese Canadians, a lot of them were brought over to essentially be like indentured servants for the railroad. And then the funny thing is there's still a disconnect between people, and I'm sure you kind of confronted this in Fiji, and we'll get into it, but there's still a disconnect with then the indigenous population and not realizing that what the legacy of that kind of heritage means. That if I'm able to, on all sides of the family, trace it back to somewhere that isn't Canada, it kinda opens your eyes. It's not about, "Oh, well, then therefore I don't have entitlement to the land." It's kind of like, what does land, what does connection even mean with that? And if we're thinking in, in terms of the Richard Powers book, The Overstory, if we're thinking about tree time, then that actually really does play a role in heritage and what that means. Yeah, it's interesting, and then there you get into the whole family tree thing, and you can make all these metaphors, but yeah, long-winded answer, I do know all the different sides.
Thank you, Kate. And you spoke about identity then. And I know that actually that formed quite a key theme in your documentary, really. And I might absolutely hash what I'm going to describe your film as here. But I guess when you approached me about it and I thought about getting involved, actually, it seemed that, yeah, you were kind of looking into animism and perhaps, yeah, the projection of identities onto trees, or the empathy that we might exhibit towards other living things, trees being the focal point. Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about film and documentaries, as I'm sure you've now experienced, is that the original kind of idea, and still what it came to be, was I wanted to look at this idea in anthropology that animism, which we'll get into, but in a very basic way, it's seeing things that are considered as non-human as possessing personhood in some level. And I wanted to analyze that theory through the context of the UK. What does that look like in a context like the UK, where we've been quite separated from that as an idea, as a practice? However, there is still an instinct there. So for me, the thing that really kind of set it all off was the felling of the sycamore gap tree and the extreme emotional reaction to that. So my film itself was about people's relationship with trees in the UK. That's the easiest way that I say it. And within that, all of the kind of reactionary, emotional messiness that comes with that, and exploring it on a kind of full sensory level rather than just completely qualitative or anecdotal level, trying to kind of capture a full picture of it while still even figuring out and picking apart kind of what that actually means, what the relationship actually is, because it's very different kind of across the board, across the country, across all of the United Kingdom. There's not one answer to that.
Yeah, and I think there is a groundswell of appetite at the moment for finding that crossover between nature, people, the issues that we're facing environmentally, socially, and the curiosity is about where those things cross over. And there has been a lot of attention on indigenous cultures, of which there are so many different iterations and manifestations of that. But what they do speak of consistently is this idea that human beings are nature. And we find that really tricky to socially say that. I think that's what I recognize. And it doesn't mean that you have to be feeling all the time like you are nature, right? I think that's the stigma attached to it, that they might be a bit hippie or a bit like left field. But I think whether we like it or not, we're having to confront the fact that we have objectified natural resources and other living things. And so learning how to remember, basically, that we are still part of that same wider system is what we absolutely have got to do. But I think looking in places that are more developed for those shreds where that does still exist is really interesting at the moment. And yeah, I think your film really played into that theme too.
Yeah, I think that is like a difficulty that I've found, is that it doesn't matter if something is socially constructed, it still has power within whatever society that's been determined. That's all language, it's all made up, but it still has the power as if it were a completely real, concrete thing. And I think it's about trying to get people into that as a discussion, and then also making people realize that as much as we try to imagine the ways in which we can obviously assert dominance over nature, in the ways that we can literally kind of tear down and build over, there are ways that nature will always still be fighting back. You can look at, like, in the wider sense of natural disaster, that's very much where we see that the buildings that we build that we think are separating us, given a hurricane, given a windstorm, those are coming down, and that separation stops. But then even on a very small level, you think about a virus, you think about a bacteria, like that can completely level a population, as we're all very, very aware from COVID. There are ways in which it's undeniable that we are part of nature. We build these separations, but it's a very porous barrier.
So when you were kind of coming up with the cast list for your documentary, of course, the trees were part of that. And for anyone who might not have seen the film, or even for those that have, maybe you want to chat us through some of the trees that you met and why they ended up featuring.
It was important for me to show these significant, undeniable trees where it shows, technically these aren't protected. So the Ankerwick Yew was a really kind of big section of it. I really loved, there was a shot where I panned and you just felt the whole width of the yew. Because I think there's an instinct in filmmaking when you're trying to capture the like significance and weight of something, that you go for a wide shot, that everything needs to be a wide shot. And I noticed this in your documentary too, that actually what can really bring people close is the close-ups, because that's how we usually will see the tree, is up close. Another big tree was the Darwin oak, which Rob McBride was kind of the champion of, and is a big champion of trees in the UK. That was an example of another huge, amazing kind of undeniable tree, but then the difference there was that it was actually under threat. And then Chester the tree in Southend-on-Sea, that was just a London plane. It was like the only London plane in this bus roundabout in tree time, young. And again, it was being threatened for development. But I think the difference with that one is that it didn't have a kind of huge visual impact that was undeniable, like the Ankerwick Yew, like the Darwin oak, where you see these are huge trees. People are like, oh, well, of course we have to keep those. I really wanted to bring that in to show, even if they're not in the countryside, that these fights still exist and these significant trees still exist. And also what allows a tree to become this huge, big, 1,000-year-old, significant kind of pillar is keeping it there, is like the very simple act of not cutting it down. And then that moves to the kind of one of the last big characters of the film, which was the sycamore gap tree, more specifically the sycamore gap stump. I went to film before little saplings sprouted up around it, so I got to get like really close and around. And the thing about that tree, which you were kind of the narrator of that whole section of the film, and as you said, I think the thing about the sycamore gap tree was that it's the only one there. That once that's gone, it's kind of a stark reminder of what's been done, that even in what is now technically a national park, that is still a product of development, that these clear, like rolling hills are still a product of development, that trees were cut down in the past, and that it can almost feel like, oh, well, the sycamore gap tree is here, even subconsciously, then you don't have to confront kind of what's been done. And then when that's gone, there was the iconography that left with it. But then, as you kind of very aptly express, that it reminds us that kind of we're also feeling like islands, like you said, like the tree. And when that's gone, it's a very stark confrontation of kind of how delicate that relation is. I stood there as long as I could that day, because it did start pouring rain, because obviously it is the north of England. But people would come up to me, we would talk about it, but some people just pass through and you could just hear this kind of like sigh, this kind of gasp, because you're not prepared for what it feels like until you're there, until you're staring at it. And it's still alive. But even with the beautiful hope of the saplings, again, those have to be protected. And as amazing of a story as that is, we will not see those saplings get to what we saw the sycamore gap is. And so that also plays into something that Matt Disney talks to, which is that like a 500-year-old tree isn't 5 times the value of a 100-year-old tree. It's thousands of times the value. So it's appreciating what that lifetime is. So I kind of wanted to show, you know, the extremes of both life and longevity, and then also threat, and then the death of the tree as we knew it with the sycamore gap. So there's kind of 3 categories of characters, then with the humans kind of sprinkled in within that, intertwined whatever way I could.
Yeah, and anthropomorphizing things is generally like a no-no. It's like a taboo thing in science and kind of secular thinking. We kind of have this, again, I see it as a bit of an illusion, and I'm not knocking science because, you know, so many great things have come from it and it ensures there remains curiosity. But I think institutionalized science can lose that air of curiosity. It can be, you know, a research project to prove a particular thing that we've already decided, yeah, this is what we want to come from that. That's why the funding's going into it. And actually the origins of science are more the bigger questions, and perhaps sometimes landing at more questions. But anthropomorphism is something we have inadvertently tried to weed out of practices by trying to, I guess, reinforce that idea that we are separate to the subject of what we are studying. However, we know that anthropomorphism is just at the root of so many relationships over evolution, and probably playing into our survival efforts as well. You know, we wouldn't have been able to survive without having some feeling or emotion or empathy that's wrapped up in that anthropomorphism. And animism speaks to that too, really, doesn't it, as well? And I know in your movie that you had some amazing captions, which was kind of like the tree talking. I thought they were so artfully considered. Like, I don't know how you came up with those, but that would be my question of like, yeah, how did you arrive at what the tree might say, knowing that that could be controversial and contentious? But yeah, I'm sure you wanted to do the best job possible.
There was a real focus on artistic freedom, that it wasn't just about kind of like true academic rigor, but then there's also this understanding that in order to get people to come into these kind of theories and to come into this kind of understanding, there needs to be accessibility beyond just like simplification. That accessibility also comes with a connection that is emotional. And that's a kind of alluding to what you were saying, is that academics will shy away from emotions because it feels unscientific, but that is how we connect to things. And that's a huge part of how we govern our lives, is what is that emotional response we have. A huge part of my documentary practice is like journaling and writing down. And a lot of the time at the beginning, I would go out, I would take pictures, and I would write about the trees that I was seeing, just kind of walking around. And then I was really inspired by, I mentioned it before, it's called The Overstory. It's a book by Richard Powers. I think it won the Pulitzer. Like it's pretty well known. But there's kind of italicized tree talk. It's difficult because you don't necessarily want to say, I'm speaking for the trees. But when there's just kind of captions that are just describing it, what it does is it really always cements us as observer and separate. And even the thing about anthropomorphizing is that I almost wanted to avoid that in the literal sense of making it human, is that I wanted to still feel like a tree was talking. So I didn't have somebody doing the voiceover. That was really important to me. I tried that out. I tried getting a friend to kind of do the voiceover. That felt like I was making a very specific choice kind of for the tree, and this is what a tree sounds like. And then somebody could go, oh, that's like a character. Your relation stops because you're like, okay, well, it sounds like a human. It is a human. Writing it was kind of a way for somebody to create their own voice in their head while they're reading it. And then the music underneath it that Nat composed, he just started kind of playing around with the idea of like the wind through trees. What does that sound like in a way? How can you capture these things that are actually experiential? But it's like when you're reading a book, like you have to think of a voice for the character. It forces you in a way that somebody just speaking at you wouldn't necessarily.
Yeah, and it's also leaving it open for interpretation. That's the other key thing, isn't it? Is some of the larger ideas are the ones that you need to leave hanging a bit for people to connect with in their own ways.
One of the most significant ones to me was talking about the shared genetics. I went to, by your suggestion, the ghost tree exhibit at Croft Castle. And that was like another kind of theme of it. There was the kind of life, threatening of life, death, but then also this idea of kind of rebirth and regrowth. And there's a caption there that said, something million billion years ago, it says like you and I shared one common ancestor. We were one. And then since then, you moved forward and I moved kind of up and down, but we still share 1/3 of those genetics. And I think that it's not, again, about making a tree into a human or a human into a tree. It's realizing that there is actually a connection there. It's a very kind of like visceral fact that even if in the end that doesn't necessarily mean anything with like how we act in life, because you can say that with a lot of living things, but it shows you this idea of tree time, that if trees live in millennia, that it's actually not that far back from when we were connected. And it talks to the metaphor of rooting, and it talks to the metaphor of family trees, and it talks to the metaphor of kind of branching out. And so much of nature is poetry. And I think that's where some of the science was moved away from, but that's how we related to nature in the beginning, was poetry and art. And it's about seeing that again, but then also allowing the tree to be the poet rather than us just to be observing it. Yeah, and that with filming the ghost trees, where it was these old, hollow, huge stumps that had little new saplings grown out around them. It really speaks to, I think, potential of where we could go if we don't continue on destruction. There's so much potential for regrowth and rebirth, and letting the trees tell us that rather than us dictating that. It takes practice to figure out what they're saying, but I think the information is there, the conversation is there.
Yeah, and thank you for leaving those long shots as well to allow that reflection, because the stuff that comes reel after reel after reel, like must make an impact in 10 seconds. My God, it moves fast, right? And then actually it was really refreshing to watch your film, because my brain was like, oh, this is quite nice, actually. I'm going to sit with this thought and see where that goes, see what I might notice in this long shot here. Yeah, you don't see many films like that. So yeah, appreciate that. And you mentioned the Overstory book, what a book that is, and one that definitely left a big impression on me. I'm quite a slow reader, and it took me ages to go through, but I quite liked that as well. I was sort of taking bits here and there. There's lots of different characters, lots of ways of viewing and thinking about trees. Again, it's not your conventional kind of edit. It does have long bits that feel like they go off on branches or tangents. And clearly that was Richard Power's intention. It kind of embodies a tree. What I wondered, Kate, is how has In Arboretum been received, and how does that compare to, I suppose, what you might have hoped the impact would be in terms of what people are getting from it?
It was really positive, which I'm really happy about, because in essence, the most important thing about this film for me was to have people just take a moment and look at trees around them. The very simple outcome of that. I had my dad visit me in London. He's not the most nature-minded of men. I mean, maybe growing up in Canada, it's kind of hard to avoid, but we were not necessarily going like camping and everything growing up. But he would start pointing out trees to me as we were walking along and sending photos. And for the people who have watched it, that has been a huge response. And that's what I'm really thrilled about, is like people realizing, oh, wow, like look at the trees around me. I stopped and I listened to a tree. That's huge. That's exactly what I want that first reaction to be. I guess what I hope in the longer run is that that reaction, that initial reaction, will go farther into feeling like, okay, then what can we do about it? How can I preserve that? What does that actually mean? Recently in Toronto, the government of Ontario tore down a huge swath of trees because the provincial government wants to develop that area and turn it into a spa. It's actually like, it seems comical, but it is true. And overnight, it happened, completely transforming the landscape. And like I want the film itself to just kind of wake people up that it's not to say that a tree can never be cut down, but it's to hold the significance of justifying why it needs to be cut down and investing in that. We can conceptualize what it means to cut down a tree, but people aren't realizing is that when a 1,000-year-old tree is cut down and a 500-year-old tree is cut down and a 100-year-old tree is cut down and a 30-year-old tree is cut down, all within the same area, we are now creating an environment that hasn't existed in thousands of years. Like, we're creating an environment that is completely new to us. And then we're going to try to act like, oh, that's fine because we'll plant 30 more. And just realizing that that's generational. And then you're thinking of replacing it with kind of one new litter. Like, that's just not how it works. So just, again, trying to open people's eyes to the significance of what it means to be surrounded by them. And then hopefully from there, from that appreciation, it actually turns into action and it turns into something more. In Canada, the question is really about deforestation and huge on a huge scale. People have this very romantic idea of what nature is in Canada, but nature is unfortunately a resource. It's a main export of Canada, and not just in beautiful pictures, but in lumber, in oil, in all of these things that's the reality of the big wide open. But even on smaller scales, on local trees, on, like I said, in Toronto and Ontario Place, like, why did all those have to come down? It's about opening people's eyes and then moving them to questioning. That's really the hope, is always like moving people to then question what's around them, their way of life, certain things like that. So the end goal is the hope that's in that. Well, it actually, I wanted to ask you a similar question that you asked me about my film, is that with Sentinels, what's your hope there with kind of the impact that that film has, how it's been received, and how you'd like it to be received in future and continuing?
Well, it's actually the very same thing that you were focusing on in Arboretum. I guess it's different in terms of the context. So whereas you focused on the UK and you have literally brought out kind of some stories or points of inspiration around our trees here and perhaps how they might think and feel about the threats that they're under silently, actually by showing the Fijian context where they are 60% forested and they haven't had campaigns quite like what we've had, you know, to save trees, but they've got a lot more of them. They have had one campaign which was really high profile, and that tree features in the documentary. It's the one in the middle of Suva. And aside from that, they've lost a lot of big trees through colonial selective logging without really being conscious of that. So they have affection and association to trees, particularly particular tree species that really underpin their culture, ancient technologies, everything, you know, from their arts and their spiritual connections as well. And I suppose when I was showing that film or trying to tell that story, I was first and foremost trying to really celebrate that part of Fijian culture through the people that were engaged with it to bring it to life. But at the same time, in the back of my brain, I was like, yeah, but also I know this content is going to be really useful as a mirror of sorts to people in the Western world, and perhaps easier to see in some ways because it feels like it's exotic, you know, it's literally the other side of the world. So their brain would be in a different mode that could be a bit more stood back and zoomed out from it to say, well, what's happening here? And a bit more curious, maybe. Really, the question I'd love at least one person to have thought was, I wonder what the indigenous beliefs might have really looked and felt like here. And yeah, not saying they would need to be particularly the same, it would be different tree species, but might the essence have been something similar, and might some of that essence still be around?
Yeah, I really loved that your film didn't fetishize the Fijian way of seeing and understanding trees. I think also the reality with a lot of what we say is indigenous conservation is that it's never separate from the context that we all exist in today. There's no context of indigenous people living that has somehow remained in isolation from the development of the world around them. So, like you showed in the film, there's McDonald's trash in the roots of the tree. These people aren't isolated, and it's not this kind of, we're not going in and showing, oh, look how beautiful and amazing these forests are, and this is exactly what we should do, and then now we're going to leave. It really felt like a collaboration, and also just like reality of what it means to actually incorporate animism, indigenous ways of life. I think some people very incorrectly, and I think this is also a result of anthropology, think it's going backwards, and it's not. That these ways of seeing exist in the current context. They exist in the present, and they don't exist in opposition to the present. They don't exist in opposition to what we know and what we've learned. They exist in tandem with it. And that's what I really loved about your film. It wasn't you kind of coming in like old school BBC style, like hosting in front of the camera and like taking a tour through Fiji. It's real Fijians who are talking about their relationship with trees. Like I remember I wrote down the stuff about the coconut tree and the umbilical cord, and I thought that was just this beautiful symbol of that connection there. And like then later on, they're saying that they use the sap or juice that come out of one tree to treat a woman after birth, just the ways in which it's still functioning in the everyday life. And we don't realize that a lot of the vitamins or medicines that we take are derivatives of natural extract. Like we still have that in our lives. It's just, again, been separated more and more. And that kind of brings me to something that I wanted to make sure that I said, that animism, originally in anthropology, like a lot of anthropology and a lot of the social sciences, was used as a way to kind of stratify cultures and to make the Western world seem more developed than what they identified as kind of primitive cultures. That a culture that practiced animism in some way wasn't developed to the point where they could realize that that wasn't the case. That was the original purpose of anthropology, realistically, as a discipline, was to justify colonialism and imperialism, and do that by what they saw as a scientific method of kind of, measuring skulls and analyzing cultural practices and saying that we are better. And then now the kind of move in anthropology, although it's still debated because obviously animism has a really problematic past, it's a term that's invented. Now there's a move that it's inherent culturally, that there's an idea that it's always kind of psychologically existed, and then your culture either allows you to practice it or it separates you from that. And that was the thing with my documentary, is that where I saw that really prominent was with the sycamore gap tree that I listened to. It was like a BBC audio documentary right after it happened, and they were interviewing people from around the area, and they had really extreme reactions of grief, but then there was also this kind of weird guilt around expressing that, or there was like this immediate qualifier of saying like, oh, it feels like there's a death, but I know that it's not a death. I know it's not that. I know that it's not a human. I know it. It's like, well, what's your reaction? The reaction is sadness. The reaction is grief. In animistic cultures, a tree isn't a human. A tree is a tree, but a tree has value and a tree has personhood. And I think we're realizing that that's the case, especially in the UK. That was like a huge part of my documentary, is that it is inherent to a lot of people. It's just we're taught to think that that is exotic or other or something else or way in the past. And it just, like you said, it's underlying. It's just trying to come up with avenues where people feel like they can express that, and express it not just in ways that are personal, but express it in ways that are kind of political also. And that's really important, is that sometimes these kind of experiences will prompt change that's a little bit inconvenient. It's not just, oh, I think we should keep this tree, and therefore that's really nice that the tree will stay up. It's like Rob McBride saying, you can't build this road that goes through here because it'll cut down the tree. And maybe that means that people don't get to go as fast through this one part of the countryside, but that's the trade-off. That's the reality. And so, yeah, I forget even where I started with going on this tangent, but that is really the important thing about looking to a lot of indigenous cultures and seeing how they practice conservation. And then instead of just extracting, it's learning and applying and kind of realizing sacrifices that need to be made in order to do that. It's not just being like, that's so nice, let's create a nature reserve. It's like, let's not build this condo in downtown because it's over top of all these trees. Like, that's really when it comes into practice. It's not just about the kind of conservation of the past. Conservation of the future is inconvenient, essentially.
Yeah, one of the major reflections I had in Fiji was that, of course, it was a very different climate. So even how natural resources can be sustained there is a different picture to Northern Europe, North America, where we have these temperate climates. And so we've had to evolve after the last ice age to learn to be really successful at planning ahead and harboring resources and probably even guarding them from each other. You know, timing things just right to get in and extract at the seasonal time that you can do that. Whereas in Fiji, things grew on trees all year round. That's a massive generalization, but there's always something available. And so that abundance is that much more present. And that actually has meant that over thousands of years, the South Pacific people have been able to live more day to day, I would say. And so that was interesting to me, that actually in the context of an ex-colony, you could see how a different mindset had been applied to an environment that perhaps didn't need that. And so you had people rejecting those newer ways, the more industrialized thinking, the more productive minded ways, to return to the villages where pace of life was slower, but ultimately people's health was way better. And I definitely felt that health benefit when I spent time in those places. Of course, I was excited to be somewhere new as well, but you could just, your body definitely just kind of took on a different mode. Of course, you're eating like food literally from right round there, sustainably made, and just a sense of community as well. But yeah, not that there aren't issues in Fiji as well. Of course, there are in every society. But it just kind of was an example perhaps of a forgotten way of living that I'd not been exposed to before. I took so much more from the people I met, in terms of learning and new ways of looking at the world than I think I could have ever shared with those guys. But at the same time, they have got mobile phones there, and like technology is changing. Their access to different ideas is changing. And that is replacing some of the ways of thinking that they have had traditionally. And yet the discussion about trees was a way to look at an indicator, if you like, of how some of that heritage was still being kept alive or not. All in all, it still just spoke to a real kind of strength and normality in how they saw other living things as in kinship to themselves, looked at the land as something they were in service to. So one of the sayings that came through, this is from Rotuma, which is one of the islands in Fiji, and where the director of National Trust Fiji, Elizabeth Eresito, comes from. And there's a saying there which is, the land has eyes to see and a mouth to bite. And I thought that really spoke volumes about how traditional Fijian cultures view the wider environment which they're a part of. So I think, it was a place that, like no other I've been, there was just a real strength of the essence of that relationship still alive, and not without, temptations, perhaps live a faster lifestyle that we're all accustomed to and brought up with.
Yeah. I think the idea that the earth will respond, the land will respond, is really important for people to realize that it's not going to be in the immediate, like, we take something away and then you're immediately going to have the recourse of it. It's this gradual, we're seeing it with climate change. It's not hard to see consequence like things will change if you start to incorporate this kind of seeing into your life, that you will want to change. It's not just that you will be forced to change. It's you'll want to change this certain kind of essentially exponential growth, because that's where a lot of the Western world is on a track of, is that everything has to have exponential growth. And we see that with technology now. We see that, there's so much that we don't need any more convenience than we have, but there's no way to just kind of plateau. There's no way to, you just have to keep going and going and going up. And then what will that look like? Past a point, it's beyond any kind of demand. It's now just creating itself. I watched this really great documentary a little bit ago that I know is available, I think even on Netflix, but it's called Yintah, Yintah, and it's about land defenders, the Wet'suwet'en Nation in kind of northern British Columbia. They hosted a blockade for Coastal GasLink, so a pipeline that was proposed. And there was a really great part of the film where one of the elders kind of confronted somebody from Coastal GasLink in this kind of community consultation that they were doing that didn't include any of the major governing people from any of the nations around. It was just kind of whoever wanted to come, and they weren't going to make another effort beyond that. And he just kind of said, like, you don't have permission to do this. You don't own this land. But then he said, no one owns this land. It's not this idea that therefore the indigenous people own it, that they have ownership over it, and that it is theirs in that sense. They are stewards to it. They occupy it. But the idea of owning, I mean, that's the real conflict in colonialism, is that any treaty, anything that happened, the idea of kind of signing off or trading land, like, what do you mean you can own this land? What do you mean that this land is yours? What do you mean that kind of that includes everything on the surface and everything below? When you talk about mining, when you talk about oil, what do you mean that you own it? It's not like land defenders are not saying this is our land in the sense that therefore we have like property rights over this. It's not yours to take and exploit. And I think that can be applied in any context beyond like settler colonial or post-colonial countries, is that still realizing like, what does that actually mean to own and to exploit? It's not about thinking that you can't see anything as a resource. Like, I think that was really great about the Sentinels documentaries, that the whole section about the canoe making, the sailboat making, is that that's all, trees and wood. Those trees were cut down to make that. But just because they have this relationship with trees, it doesn't mean that they can't use the trees. But it's also not seeing that abundance is a resource that can be depleted, that a forest, therefore, is a resource. It's like, no, a tree is, but a forest isn't like a grocery store. Like, you can't just like take it all you want. And I think that is the conflict of like what I said before, that exponential growth requires abundance in that sense, that is at ends with the reality of kind of the world and conservation and ecology and just like how things will operate. And every year, if we're growing up, we're reaching unprecedented territory of extraction. That's the other reality, is like, even if it worked 10 years ago, we're doing tenfold of what we did before that. So what that is actually going to look like, I mean, we can predict it. Scientists have said what that actually is going to be, the consequences of that. But it's really hard for people to see that far beyond. But that's how you have to try to look, is generations. And like I said before, tree time, like thinking about it like that, that's the difficulty. And I mean, that's, like you said, that's the hope in the films, is to try to get people to see differently, but then act differently is the whole other hurdle that it's difficult. Yeah, I'm not really sure what next steps are really, but we're trying.
What's important is that you find something for yourself that it's leading to a difference, and that is still worth it, and valuing and treasuring that, and also valuing the way that others people might be able to do that in ways you can't as well. You don't have to try and fix the whole thing.
Yeah. Awareness is always the first step. And you don't have to see it like sobriety or abstinence. Like if you for some reason have to buy something in plastic, it's not like you should feel terrible about that. It's really hard to avoid. And so it's about trying to make everyday changes and choices, but guilt will get people nowhere. Guilt paralyzes people, and it only kind of usually thrusts people further into whatever kind of destructive patterns or whatever kind of routines they were in before, because it just makes people feel bad, and then they feel bad for a little bit, and then they move on, and then they just keep going because they just want to ignore that bad feeling. And I think that is actually the space that documentaries and art can really occupy now. It's that, you know, we have the headlines, we have news sources, we have all the immediate stories at our fingertips. We have all the facts kind of at our fingertips. So then the thing that you actually can take advantage of with filmmaking or photography or visual art in some way is then telling the longer story, telling the personal stories, taking time with it. And even podcasts, because anybody, like I said, can Google this and find articles to get all of the kind of bare bones facts of it. So once somebody has read that, how can we bring them beyond it to actually community and action and ways of thinking that aren't just kind of like factual, here you go, and then move on with your life.
What I really like about chatting with you and taking an interest in your work as well is that it definitely carries with it an optimism. And, you know, you spoke about doom and gloom and some of these huge issues that we discuss on this podcast and in the world. It's really easy to get kind of bogged down in those. But yeah, I think there's the hope in how you talk about these things. And I think that's so important. And that's clearly what you carry with you. So yeah, respect to you for keeping that positivity going. I'm going to hand to you now for some final words for our listeners. But yeah, thank you for a great chat.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think final thoughts, especially when we were talking about animism. Like I said, it was originally informed as a very colonial belief around trying to separate people and trying to posit one culture, Western culture, as above the more, quote, primitive indigenous cultures. Now what we're seeing is that people want to take from indigenous cultures in these beautiful idealism, these beautiful ideas of conservation. But as I keep saying throughout this podcast, that's resistance. And actually incorporating the idea of personhood in non-human beings is an act that it takes work. It takes work to see trees as significant. It takes work to see what's around us as nature and what we are as nature. And it can be inconvenient. And so it's not work that can be done alone. It's work that's really important to find community in and to read books about and to watch films about. And it isn't just about statistics. It's about experience. It's about emotion. And it's about responding to your own emotion that's going on around you. It was, I think, like 20 degrees at the end of October in Toronto. That's not normal. And it's recognizing that emotional response of dread when that comes up. But it's also about, what does it feel like to sit down in a forest and look up? Go out and do that and really connect. I think there are ways in which it's actually quite easy. You don't need to take a plane. You don't even need to take a car. Walk somewhere, sit down and look up. And that really changed my life in a lot of ways, was just taking time and living in tree time for a bit, living in a very slower pace wherever you can. I think that's what really needs to be incorporated. It's not something that's foreign. It's actually way more inside than people realize.
Listening to the Meaning of Trees podcast. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And see you next time.